permission of the chair to add something to, not to reply in Esther's place, of course not, but to react to something that she had said in her previous intervention. Is that possible?
Yeah, of course.
Well, thank you for asking this question about Spinoza after I alluded to his provocative and seemingly very conservative formulation at the beginning of the political treatise. I will not start another course on Spinoza. This is the point on which I have a very friendly and in fact also rather sharp disagreement and dispute with my friend Tony Negri. I already alluded to that in a conversation with some of you after the class, but I'll repeat basically what I had said. The paradox in Spinoza is that he resumes the, he's seemingly closed and in fact open. But how? So he apparently resumes the most traditional form of classification of political regimes. Monarchy, aristocracy, different kinds of, there are two types of monarchies, two types of aristocracies, and democracy. But then the democracy is missing. A number of reasons on which one can speculate, but the basic, the traditional understanding is he didn't have time because he died, unfortunately, at that moment, just before he had written a few lines, on democracy, and suddenly he died, with the whole world witnessing, as Ventura explained to us in a fantastic allegory. So we lack it. So what to do? So basically, Tony Negri's position is, let's write the chapter that Spinoza did not write. And this chapter, of course, will be an extraordinary exposition of what the power, in the sense of potentia, not potestas, and not state power, if you like, but common power of the multitude, can be, and how it can organize itself when it remains, what it can achieve when it remains a constituent power without ever becoming a constituted power. That is, in fact, if you want to be honest, without ever becoming institutionalized. In fact, in the strong sense, or in the state sense. Okay, and I think that this is precisely the point on which Spinoza stumbled. Because, of course, his classification of regimes was a classification of imperia, that is, not only institutions, but in fact, state institutions. And as a consequence, when he wanted to put together, on the one side, the requisite of state, which was also the requisite of security and stability, and the requisite of radical democracy, if you like, to put that in modern terms, he found himself before a contradiction that he could not solve. Which is not to say that he says nothing about democracy, but in my opinion, where he says something very important about democracy is precisely in the other two in the analysis of the other two regimes. That is, when he speaks about monarchy and when he speaks about aristocracy, which I basically take to be chapters devoted to the two following problems. One, how to democratize monarchy, and that goes beyond constitutional monarchy, in fact. And how to democratize aristocracy, which goes beyond, of course, simply the rule of law. So, of course, this can be seen as reformist procedures, or perhaps also as subversive procedures, which take us beyond, in fact, inevitably beyond the limits. And we are back to the wonderful formulas that Ventura is using: democracy without end, or democratization of democracy. Now, I asked the permission to return now for very briefly to the question posed by Esther in her previous intervention. She spoke of defending the institutions. I mean, the dilemma before which we find ourselves in the current situation, in which we're torn, in a sense, we find ourselves in the paradoxical situation of needing to defend institutions which are threatened of deconstruction or demolition, not for progressive or revolutionary motives and reasons, but in the service of the new, most oppressive form of global order. So the state, the university, and others. I would ask Esther if she'd agree to make a distinction between the idea of defending an institution, this or that institution, which can be necessary, of course, tactically, and defending the institution or the idea of institution. The two things are not the same, and do not lead to the same type of conclusion. To be clearer, somebody asked a question about alternatives. One of the things that I submit to discussion, I don't have any certainty about that, but I think it's crucial, and which would also allow us to bring together the experiences of different generations, different critical generations, the 68ers, the old guys like me, for example, and the young critical minds and revolutionaries of today, and the indignados, has to do with the question whether it is worth inventing inventing alternative institutions, or alternative forms for the institution. For example, Boaventura's idea of the University of the People is an alternative institution. I tend to believe that we urgently need a number of proposals to transform the institutions, that is, invent alternative institutions. And I find it very remarkable, for example, that in France, in the years after 68, Foucault and others were very deeply linked to that, but some Lacanians as well, the name under which anti-psychiatric movement developed was a very strange name, psychiatrie institutionnelle, institutional psychiatry, which did not mean we want to keep the psychiatric hospital as it exists at all costs, but we need to invent alternative forms of institutions. Now, of course, behind that, there is a metaphysical and anthropological presupposition, which is not innocent, and which perhaps ought to be challenged. And the critique that Esther was, from what I understand, I lament not having followed the class, but deriving from her readings in her class, might perhaps go in that direction. This metaphysical or anthropological prerequisite is the one that you find in Freud, the one that you find even more in Lacan than in Freud, namely the idea that the human as such is an institutional being. That is, and this involves, of course, an element of alienation on the one sense, but also an element of permanent construction or creation of institutions on the other side. Why that? Because the human nature doesn't exist as such. There is no primary nature. It exists only. This was already Rousseau's idea. It exists only as a sort of secondary construction. But the post-human, you ask the question, is perhaps an idea that breaks with this prerequisite. So it would be very strongly, and I would even say violently anti-Freudian, anti-Lacanian, if you like. Another name for institution, of course, is the symbolic. It's the symbolic. It's the same, of course. The symbolic takes the form of the juridical, it takes the form of the theological, it takes probably other forms as well. Science is clearly a very powerful realization of the symbolic. The list is not necessarily finished, but the great metaphysical issue is there, and it has political consequences. Do we think that there is no human without institutions, and therefore do we look politically for the recreation or the invention of alternative institutions, or do we imagine that we could in fact live as humans, as societies, or perhaps as living beings beyond, in fact, the alienating framework of the institution as such?